Schumacher had just taken pole in a second consecutive win. He would be joined by his teammate on the front row for a row 1 lockout, which was then converted to the then maximum 18 points for the team. But we're not talking about the reigning double champions out of Maranello. It was Ralph on a tear flanked by Juan Pablo Montoya. And it was the Williams team surging. With more than 60% of the 2003 season wrapped up, Kimi Räikkönen now faced only a single-digit margin to Michael Schumacher in the Drivers' Championship. Moreover, Williams as a constructor sliced Ferrari's advantage to a shockingly manageable margin of just 3 points, as they were showing to still have some 90s glory hidden in the car powered by a monstrously strong BMW engine. Ferrari were in trouble, which was a foreign situation given Michael had just come off a season where he took nearly a dozen wins, failing to ever even miss a podium. And while he had won at Silverstone in his remarkable 2002 campaign, he's had to watch McLaren stand on the top step of the podium since the biggest wreck of his career knocked him out of contention of the 1999 title. Barrichello wasn't doing Ferrari any favors either coming into the 2003 British Grand Prix, managing only 13 points and a single podium across 4 races where the sister car had garnered 3 podiums and a win. They needed a spark to turn things around and propel Ferrari back into clear control of the championship. But what happened next, I'm 100% certain no one saw coming. And while the incident at the 2003 British Grand Prix was one of the most bizarre and unique moments in F1's rich history, Silverstone has played host to a number of memorable Formula 1 moments. Look no further than round 4 of the 2020 season at the British Grand Prix, where for the first time in history, a car wins a race on 3 wheels. And that's just in recent history. Let's go back in time and look at the top 4 most memorable moments at one of the most historic circuits on the calendar. And when I say back, I'm talking way back. 70 years in fact. 25,657 days to be exact. That's how long it's been since the May 13th start date of the 1950 FIA Championship of Drivers, which took place at the Silverstone circuit. And to this day, this would be one of the latest starts to the Formula 1 racing season. Fast forward 70 years, and 2020 had a little bit to say about that. This current season's July 5th round 1 is by far the latest start in the sport's 70-year history. But a late start date is better than none at all. So if only ceremoniously, I'm slotting the 1950 British Grand Prix as Silverstone's number 4 moment. Number 4, the inaugural World Championship of Drivers race of 1950. As mentioned, this was one of the latest season debuts on record. And over the years, many things have changed since, of course. The first and most obvious are the naming conventions. While it may sound like semantics, the differences matter. If you're scratching your head wondering why I've called it the FIA World Championship of Drivers, well, it's simply because the name as we know it today, the FIA Formula 1 World Championship, wasn't adopted until 1981. And although Silverstone did indeed play host to the very first FIA World Championship race, there had been racing under the Formula 1 regulations since 1947 after recovery from World War II had all been but complete. Up until May 13th, 1950, the top single-seater drivers competed in the European Championship of Grand Prix Motor Racing. The 1950 British Grand Prix was one of 7 races included in the championship, with more events than not held in non-championship races. 6 of the 7 races were held in Europe, with the Indianapolis 500 as the only non-European race included. It was also one of the only races under non-Formula 1 regulations. Despite it remaining in the championship in following seasons, ultimately, there weren't many drivers successfully making that crossover drive. I cover more of the divergence of American and European motorsports here. Check it out if you're curious. I hear Gunther Steiner gives it 5 stars. The official championships may have been new, but the field was astoundingly old at that first race, at least by today's standard. And for reference, for the likes of Sebastian Vettel, who either currently weighs retirement from an illustrious career spanning more than a dozen years, or considers going to Aston Martin, a grizzly old vet on today's grid, the 33-year-old would be among one of the youngest in the field that averaged 39 years old at that 1950 Grand Prix. And to further illustrate my point, you'd have to combine Seb and sophomore standout Lando Norris to match the most senior driver of the 1950 British Grand Prix field at 53 years old. In fact, there were 3 drivers in their 50s, and the youngest of the field was 29-year-old Briton Geoffrey Crossley, was roughly the same age as Sergio Perez, Daniel Ricciardo, and Valtteri Bottas. Alfa Romeo stole the show, taking all 3 podium spots. The winner of the race was the 43-year-old Italian, Nino Farina. He would then go on to become the first official FIA Formula 1 Drivers' World Champion. With the likes of Farina and Fangio behind the wheel, the Alfa Romeo team dominated, winning every single Grand Prix that year. Fangio in particular claimed victory in all championship races he didn't retire from, which, as it turned out, was a considerable amount, including the race at Silverstone. While Formula 1 as an organized championship was new, racing sure wasn't, and fans showed up in droves to watch the action at Silverstone. It is estimated that 200,000 spectators welcomed the 1950 season and its inaugural Grand Prix. This even included the royal family, as King George and Queen Elizabeth made this the only instance a reigning monarch was present at a British motorsport event. The late Sterling Moss was also in attendance, racing in a support event. He reflected on his 1950 British Grand Prix by saying the following: "I met King George and Queen Elizabeth that day, which was awe-inspiring for someone who is just 20 years of age. But not all memorable moments are ones we look back on through rose-tinted lenses. The beauty of Formula One is the dance a driver does with machine, knowing they are operating on the limits with perfect precision. The thrill of watching world-class athletes with killer instincts, standing by waiting for each mistake for the car in front of them so they can strike little by little. Missed apex by missed apex, chicane by chicane. But when a driver does put a foot out of place, we as the audience can only hope for the best. And at these speeds, life can be the price you pay for these mistakes. The worst was feared in our next gripping moment at Silverstone, nearly a quarter of a century later." Number 3. The 1973 race start pileup. The 1973 British Grand Prix featured one of the largest pileups in the sport's history. Up to that point in the season, it was an incredibly tight race in both championships. The Lotus 72 was a product of Chapman and proved to be a highly successful race car. Variations of the 72 design were responsible for 3 of the first 4 championships in the 1970s. The battle with Team Tyrrell was fierce, as either team won each round leading to Silverstone, aside from McLaren's win at the Scandinavian Raceway in round 7. Jackie Stewart had been losing to Emerson Fittipaldi after a very strong start from his Lotus, but a string of missed points allowed Jackie to usurp the defending champion headed into Silverstone. Talk about bad omens, the start of the race was met with immediate contact. A 24-year-old Niki Lauda was unable to get away thanks to driveshaft issues. His BRM was subsequently rear-ended on the starting line. Conversely, the race would start beautifully for Jackie Stewart. Despite a second-row start, he'd be leading the Grand Prix by Beckett's on lap 1. But then, it happened. Headed into Woodcote, Jody Scheckter, who had just been jumped by Carlos Reutemann, would put him into a premature throttle-induced spin that put him into the barrier. Due to the high-speed nature of the impact into that wall, he would pinball back into the center of the track, sitting there motionless, a sitting duck. The American and eventual winner of that Grand Prix, Peter Revson, would just barely miss him, and Scheckter would get by with a couple more misses, but the rest wouldn't be so fortunate. His M23 soon became a magnet for other race cars, despite him raising his arms in his best efforts to alert the other drivers. There was really only so much he could do, and thus, one of the largest pileups in the history of F1 would ensue as the field would be cut in half in the blink of an eye. Shockingly, no one was seriously injured aside from Andrea de Adamic, who had badly injured his ankle. It would go on to be his final Formula One race. It took less than 2 hours for the scene to be cleared, and the race was again underway. Revson's McLaren would get away best, and he'd stay in front, taking his first victory, followed closely by Ronnie Peterson, Denny Hulme, and James Hunt, who all crossed the finish line within 1 second of each other. While it's perfectly logical to think that all of the F1 action takes place, well, on track, there are times when it moves elsewhere. How about a story from pit lane? Let's talk about a very weird and the only time that a race was won from the pits. Number 2. Schumacher's first ever British Grand Prix win from pit lane. The 1998 British Grand Prix at Silverstone was another controversial moment for one of the most polarizing drivers. Michael Schumacher entered the race with consecutive wins in Canada and France. But despite his best efforts, the then Ferrari man was coming up short. Mika had already racked up quad wins, 3 podiums, and a pair of retirements. To win this season, it became clear that the then double world champion would need to pull out all of the stops to stop his McLaren rival. And ironically, it was a stop that gave him the go-ahead win at Silverstone that season. He got a little help from less than stellar stewarding. Here's how it happened. Häkkinen would dominate the rain-soaked event, but it became clear that conditions were starting to become dangerous as drivers were sliding off all over the place. The race order at the time was Häkkinen, Schumacher, and then Irvine. Meanwhile, the track order was interrupted by backmarkers, namely the Benettons of Fisichella and Wurz. It was reported that somewhere just as the standing yellow flag would come out and the safety car was triggered, that Schumacher's Ferrari had overtaken a Benetton. Immediately following the incident, the stewards did not make it clear to the teams what had actually happened. That yellow flag in lap 43 would bring out former British F3 champion Oliver Gavin, who would then take the grid around a number of laps while the conditions improved. And as you can see here, Schumacher trails the race leader Mika Häkkinen, a lap Fisichella, and Takagi's Tyrrell. Walker and Brundle both confirm Michael's tight hands as he's at the mercy of Fisichella and Takagi to stay close to Mika in front.
No, you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to pass under the full course yellow. Takagi's got to get on with it. It's really bad news. It happens in sports car races a lot. If you get behind a very slow car, you can't even catch the safety car up if you're not careful.
And despite a number of occasions where it appears that Michael is going to pass Fisichella, it's pretty clear that he knows better and he's just trying to keep him honest. On lap 49, it is signaled that the safety car is set to leave and the race will resume at the control line as per the regulations. On cue, just after crossing the line, Schumacher and Irvine would make it past both Benetton immediately.
Schuey's going around the outside. He must not pass him until that start-finish line on the exit of Woodcote. And let's see what happens. He's what he's going to do. He's holding position. Look, he's holding back. He knows what he's going to do. Well done, Michael. Now you can go for it. Yeah, now Michael is in the clear legally, and he can set about. Mika Häkkinen, and the pressure is on.
Meanwhile, the Ferrari garage have yet to be informed of the impending penalty Michael has earned. The first lap of the restart had Michael looking like the more confident of the two in the wet. This would prove to be reality, as shockingly, Häkkinen would make an error on lap 51 and he would end up in the grass.
And Schumacher, Häkkinen goes off, and Schumacher leads. Michael Schumacher leads the British Grand Prix on lap 51. Now, I would venture a guess that nothing is going to stop Michael Schumacher now.
This gave Michael the rare window to squeeze by and go on to take the race lead. By lap 58, Schumacher is now 18 seconds ahead of Mika Häkkinen. In comes the controversy. We see something weird happen. Michael enters pit lane on the final lap. And what's critical to note here is the Ferrari garage is beyond the control line, so effectively he's crossed the finish line, satisfying the number of laps needed to finish that Grand Prix, 60 laps. Based on the testimony and what we know at that time, Ferrari weren't exactly sure what the stewards were saying the penalty was. It was either 10 seconds stop-go, or it was 10 seconds added time. But either way, Michael would win if he served both. But let's establish the key facts and the timeline of what happened because it's really interesting and it's a little bit convoluted. At 3:15 p.m., there was a note that came through that the number 3 of Michael Schumacher had passed the number 6, Alexander Wurz, immediately after a stationary yellow flag. The confirmed marshal note was relayed to race control at 3:17 p.m. In the official hearing, the race director had testified to only learning about the incident at 3:25 or 3:30 p.m. Race director then asked steward not to take action during the race. They needed to make sure there was sufficient evidence to go forward with this. And here's where the first major error occurs. On lap 54, just under 10 minutes of learning about the incident at 3:39 p.m., the steward, who had seemingly ignored race director's wishes not to post a penalty during the race, issued a 10-second time penalty to the driver, citing Article 57. This was done in written form, and simultaneously, race control was not alerted so other teams weren't notified via timing monitors. Now, it wasn't until 3:46 p.m., 7 additional minutes later after the official ruling had been given, that Ferrari were themselves informed. Keep in mind, this is on the 58th lap of a Schedule 60. The penalty stipulates a 10-second time penalty imposed via Article 57, and it's here that unquestionably the decision should have been flashed on timing screens. But where the error occurred was that Article 57 does clearly state that it needs to happen within the final 12 laps of the race, and this absolutely did not. It occurred on lap 43 by all accounts, which would be 17 laps before the end of the race, which would clearly fall outside this viable window. The other thing that many people objected to, including McLaren, was that Michael Schumacher had crossed the finish line from the pit lane. The problem was, in Article 163 and 14 of the 1998 Formula 1 regulations, this was legal. And the really interesting thing is, it's not even a loophole. The language in the regulation is actually quite clear. It says that the finish line is constituted by a single line which crosses both the track and the pit lane. And despite the fact that that 10-second time penalty didn't occur in the final 12 laps as the regulations said that it had to, Michael Schumacher was 22 seconds ahead of the McLaren of Mika Häkkinen. Deducting an incremental 10 seconds wouldn't change the outcome of the race. And on top of all that, things got worse for the stewards. As you've probably noticed, I've been noting the timestamps, and that's for good reason. At that point, in the 1998 regulations, the stewards only had 25 minutes to deliver their final decisions. And taking into consideration the specific times and a little bit of rounding, 31 seconds had elapsed between the time it was initially transmitted to race control at 3:17 up until the official ruling was given to Ferrari. So not only were the stewards in breach of notifying the teams under the appropriate times under Article 57, but they also failed to give the correct penalty at all, considering this was not in the final 12 laps of the race. The only viable option that McLaren really had was to say that the stewards shouldn't have cost them a race, which, to be fair, that's what I would say too, but that's nowhere in the regulations, and that's an embarrassing move on the stewards' part, but it's not Michael Schumacher's problem. So at the end of the day, the race truly came down to 6 minutes, and I'm not talking about on track. The 25 minutes that they were allotted to tell the teams of the penalty, the 31 minutes that it took to tell Ferrari. That net 6 minutes led to one of the most controversial finishes at Silverstone, and one of the most memorable moments. And what a pleasant surprise to see indeed, Ferrari actually winning on strategy for a change. Even with the final classification being honored that resulted in Schumacher taking the win and Häkkinen P2, It was Mika who'd had the final laugh, as he would take his first world championship and McLaren taking the Constructors' Championship in 1998. Mika and Michael would go on to battle on track as rivals for a few more years, which led to more great moments, which I've talked about in the past. You know the deal. If you want to know more, check out the link in the description. If you'd like to see a full official report from the FIA directly from the proceedings themselves, I've created a downloadable copy of that meeting's minutes down in the description. Just click the link, tell me where to send it, and you'll be on your way. As we've seen, safety cars play a major role in Formula 1 and can have a very pronounced impact on results. And while Silverstone is often the victim of the common British shower that are notorious to the region during the summer, the 2003 British Grand Prix safety car wasn't spurred on by wet conditions. But now that we set up the scene from the start of the video, let's return to the site of the most unforgettable moment from Silverstone, at least in my opinion. Number 1. A Priest in Barrichello's masterclass. Ferrari needed a good result, and Barrichello set up his redemption race perfectly. He was on pole position, and his teammate Schumacher was back on the third row. It came undone at the start of the race, where Barrichello conceded his advantage thanks to a poor start. Trulli and Raikkonen would move past the Brazilian with the Schumacher brothers in hot pursuit, and just a handful of laps into the race, Coulthard's headrest would come undone, bringing on a very quick safety car, which allowed Barrichello to close up the gap. He would continue to push and eventually got around Raikkonen's McLaren by lap 11, and on lap 12, the Grand Prix Priest, as he was henceforth known, earned his name. There was a man on track, and this man was Neil Horan.
Safety car out, of course. The drivers, oh my word, thinking about a pass there. David Coulthard on Olivier Panis. Well, what can you say? That is absolutely unbelievable.
He would come waltzing down directly into oncoming traffic. He was proudly brandishing a sign that read, "Read the Bible is always right." And by the looks of it, he wanted the drivers to get a good look at it, seemingly not concerned about his own life or the lives of the drivers and the risk he posed to them in open-wheel cockpit racing cars. Despite the swift action by the marshals, the, quote, lunatic on the track still very nearly encountered a very unpleasant meeting with a couple high-performance race cars and all their carbon fiber glory. And a very small, moving target is hard enough to avoid while maintaining control of the car, let alone when it's weaving into your path, lurching even, in your direction. Stephen Green tackled the track invader on Hanger Straight. He later recounted the events by saying the following: "The first thing you do, obviously, is look behind you. And there's this guy running up in a green and in a kilt, and holding banners and going at cars. Literally, as they came around the corner, he would run at them, almost as if he was going to run under the front wheels." And as mentioned, this lunatic in skirts, as Briatore dubbed him, was none other than Neil Horan, a then Irish Roman Catholic priest. Following his removal from the race, he was charged with aggravated trespassing, but this wouldn't slow him down. He went on disturbing the public with his, well, let's call them protests. Formula 1 was just the tip of the iceberg. After being subdued at the Epsom Derby before he was thought to have run on the track in front of the horses, he ended the year by tackling the 2004 Olympic marathon leader, who held nearly a 50-second advantage over the next runner into the crowd. De Lima would recover, but only managed third place at the Greece Summer Games. And for this, Horan received a 12-month suspended sentence on the grounds of his mental state. It wasn't until after a couple of these high-profile incidents that Horan was defrocked. But the show must go on, and this race takes a top spot for more than just one, albeit very strange, disruption. Because the second safety car coincided on lap 12 with the natural time to pit, many of the front runners used this opportunity to stop at their garage, and they were forced to stack. Barrichello was forced to watch all of the work he put in over the past dozen laps dissipate thanks to the priest. The sudden pit stop massively reshuffled the entire field. Schumacher and JPM both fell outside the top 10, while Barrichello hung on just in 8th place. Ralf Schumacher and Raikkonen got a favorable stop and came out ahead of Barrichello, as did Trulli. On track, the race was led by the Toyotas, who decided not to pit, along with Coulthard, who only a handful of laps ago had made his pit to resolve his headrest issues. On the restart, Raikkonen was on a mission, passing Trulli immediately, and it wasn't long before he was on targeting his teammate. A handful of laps later, Barrichello was able to get around the Williams car, and now had to fight Trulli for position. It would take him 10 laps to clear him, and all the while those behind the leaders were squabbling. Those leading the race, they were extending their lead. Raikkonen inherited the lead on lap 30 just as the second Toyota would pit, leaving Barrichello to chase after Kimi in clean air. The next laps were critical for Barrichello as he fell outside of Kimi's pit window, but he could reduce the advantage the Finn would have after they traded pit stops. After setting the fastest lap, he seemed to have received the blessing from Horan himself as the speed god smiled favorably on him. He went on to carve 9 seconds out of the gap in just 4 laps. The second round of pit stops had Barrichello emerge within striking distance of the race leader, having just 3 seconds and change to make up.
And I think Raikkonen is going to take the lead of the British Grand Prix as Rubens Barrichello comes out. He couldn't do enough in the laps that counted, and Raikkonen leads at Silverstone.
but I think he's fast enough to catch Raikkonen again and start putting him under pressure.
Despite his sensational pace, he had work to do, but he was soon bearing down on Kimi, and Barrichello's plan was working. The idea was simple: put Kimi under as much pressure as humanly possible. Kimi was caught out of shape around Stowe on lap 43, and this is where the overtake would truly begin. He would give Kimi a couple of looks coming out of the next few turns, and then it was his time to strike. He would go wheel to wheel with Raikkonen, but the work he had done in these previous turns left him in the best position. He was on the throttle earlier, and Kimi had no choice but to defend, and this led to an unforced error. Barrichello was through, and he was on to the race win. And while Neilhorn was definitely a kilted blemish on the day, his antics caught a lot of these front runners out, and they were forced to properly race. So if there's anything to take, at least we had that. And in a race where some of the top drivers in top cars were forced in poor positions where they were forced to drive and push the car to the maximum, it was Rubens Barrichello who took the day, claimed it his, and took the win. Because this race was the most dynamic in many ways, it's my #1 most memorable moment at Silverstone. Did your most unforgettable moment make the list? Did I miss any? Let me know below what your top 4 from Silverstone are. Also, make sure to leave any feedback you have for these. If you enjoy them, I'll keep making them. And if this video gets 1,000 likes in the first 24 hours of posting, I'll keep doing it for the next Grand Prix. But that's all for now. Thanks for checking this out, and I'll see you very, very soon.